Samsung's new S24 series has been out for just over a month now. I bought the phones at launch, which means I can not only give you a more thorough review of my experience so far, but I've also waited for the major software update Samsung just released. So we can now see if they've been able to fix any of those early issues when we get to the side-by-side comparisons. I think the camera update in particular will be interesting, and hopefully this in-depth review will give you a much closer reflection of what you can expect from the S24 Ultra. The major talking point this year is of course AI. You can expect that to be the new smartphone trend for the next couple of years at least, and in this video we'll be exploring exactly how those new AI features will change the way you use your phone, if at all, as well as everything else that's changed from the S23 Ultra. That was one of my favourite phones released last year, and arguably the best, so we'll also be seeing if the latest generation does enough to justify buying instead. I've unboxed this in a short already, so let's get straight into the design. I went for the new titanium grey finish, which I think offers a refreshingly different experience from the classic matte black I typically go for. It's certainly the most interesting of the new colours this year, especially with how it changes between grey, silver and a metallic beige depending on how the light hits it. I really like it. And yes, Apple fans in the comments, obviously Samsung took inspiration from the iPhone this year. Apple copies Samsung as well, it's what phone companies do, and it ultimately leads to better choices for us consumers. But aside from the new colours, you'd be forgiven for initially thinking not much has changed. We have an almost identical rear camera layout, the same button placement, and the dimensions are much the same as well. The new phone is marginally shorter, thinner, but wider. One pretty major change though is that Samsung has finally ended its near-decade-long commitment to curved displays. The S24 Ultra's glass is completely flat, and that's great for a few reasons. Number one, no more accidental screen touches. Although that was a rare occurrence for me on the S23 Ultra, it was still an occurrence. This is also better for the S Pen. Flat displays are just more functional. They're also easier and cheaper to fit screen protectors to. Plus, the glass on a flat display is more protected by the frame in the event you accidentally drop this. The reason Samsung curved the display before was to try to thin the display bezels further, and I'll admit you can't quite achieve this with the S24 Ultra. However, the bezels are now completely symmetrical. You get a thinner chin too. I personally think this is more aesthetically pleasing and definitely prefer the improved screen usability. Also notice the smaller hole punch for the selfie lens. That's a nice minor change too. The S24's frame feels nicer to hold in the hand as well. You've got one smooth surface at the sides now, which Samsung has gently rounded off to improve comfort. They've also switched from aluminium to titanium, and whilst you sadly don't get the dramatic weight reduction iPhone users experienced, it's nonetheless an upgrade. This satin finish again feels nicer to touch, and is definitely an aesthetic improvement from the glossy fingerprint magnet frame of last year's model. More importantly though, titanium brings a further durability improvement versus the S23's aluminium frame. Plus, the display now has improved scratch resistance with Gorilla Glass armour. So these seemingly subtle changes actually amount to a pretty nice improvement for the aesthetics, ergonomics, and certainly durability. You might assume the same about the displays as well, and once again we have a Quad HD Plus dynamic AMOLED, and the LTPO tech brings a variable refresh rate from 1 up to 120Hz. An improvement though is the extended range of brightness. The display now gets even dimmer, which no one really talks about, and also increases the peak brightness up to 2600 nits. Visibility outdoors is now dramatically improved, but it's not actually to do with the increased brightness so much, it's the Gorilla Glass armour. The new glass greatly reduces reflections, hopefully you can see the difference side by side here, and I initially absolutely loved this and considered it one of the most significant smartphone display upgrades we've seen for years. But there's one major caveat. If you apply a screen protector, as most of us do, you then lose that anti-reflective advantage. The screen then becomes as reflective as your screen protector is, which is a real shame. The Ultra's display remains as sharp and colourful as ever, and I actually like the slightly more realistic, vivid colour profile Samsung has tuned for the new model. They've admittedly been bested in some display specs, like the insane 4500 nit brightness on the OnePlus 12, but the non-reflective glass gives it a unique edge, and now that it's flat, now that the bezels are symmetrical, the Ultra has the strongest argument for best smartphone display on the market. A quick note on the speakers, the bottom firing one has a new cutout design versus the grille from last year, but don't expect any major changes in the speaker quality. I compared both side by side, and there's almost no discernible difference at all. The S24 series ships with One UI 6.1 on Android 14, and it brings a few new features. A couple of them seem to be borrowed from the iPhone, such as adaptive color tone for the display, and the other is having your wallpaper and widgets as part of the always-on display. This is more battery intensive though, and not something I use. A change I'm more excited about is Quick Share merging with Nearby Share. This is essentially Android's AirDrop, and it's going to make file sharing between any Android phones easier, and it doesn't have to be Samsung-only phones. You can expect most of these smaller changes to be brought down to older devices though in future, so I'll focus more on the new AI features instead. The biggest one, the one you've probably seen already, is Google's Circle to Search. You can now circle basically anything on your screen at any time and get a preview of Google's search results for it without having to leave the app. For example, a piece of furniture you spotted on Instagram, maybe it's a piece of tech you saw in a YouTube video. Circle to Search feels intuitive, especially with the S Pen, and I think that's why this works as a genuinely useful shortcut. There are a bunch of new Pixel 8 inspired camera AI features like editing tools to detect and move objects, resize them, or even erase them entirely. We've seen generative fill before, and it varies in both how long this takes and also the quality of the results. Generally, I'm not a huge fan of digital manipulation of photos to this extent. I prefer something more real, but I can see that it's useful to have those tools as an option, and I like that Samsung will brand any AI-altered images even after they leave your device. When browsing the web, you can now get AI-generated summaries of articles. Again, these vary in terms of their accuracy and usefulness. I generally didn't love this myself. The misfires just reminded me that AI is still flawed. Nor did I enjoy using Samsung's internet browser. I'm happier not having this feature, but using Chrome. And then there are AI components for messaging and calls. You can generate suggestions to rewrite your messages in a foreign language, or even in a more professional or a more casual way. As you'd expect, the latter was interesting to see once, but I'll never actually use this. Sadly, the Samsung keyboard is awful right now. I don't know what they've done, but autocorrect is a complete mess, consistently failing basic punctuation and grammar. It's almost inexplicable, and the only thing I could come up with was that this is an attempt to force you into using the AI corrections. But if so, that's not made very clear. The AI feature I was most impressed with is live translation. On a phone call, you can get AI-generated translations for what you and your caller are saying, so you can both speak in your native tongue. You'll hear this and see it transcribed on your S24 Ultra, whilst your caller will hear the translation read aloud in their language, whatever phone they have. It's very clever and just about works fast enough to be practical. From my testing, the translation quality varies from near perfect to downright awful. But with how quickly AI is improving, I can definitely see the potential in this going forwards. So there are some cool AI things here, but probably nothing that compensates for how bloated and cluttered One UI feels at this point. That's a whole video in itself. And to be honest, there's nothing new software-wise that's truly compelling for S23 owners either. We've actually recently learned that these AI features are also coming to at least the S23 series, and very soon too. I also think it's a shame that Samsung buries away the truth that the AI features are only free for a couple of years. When already paying over $1,000 for this smartphone, the idea of a further subscription model is pretty uninviting. I do want to credit Samsung for matching Google and promising 7 years of software support for the S24 series. That's obviously excellent and even surpasses Apple, as long as they actually stick to it. I also know that the people who buy the Ultra will definitely upgrade way before those 7 years are up, but taking this on face value, it's still promising and bodes well for people looking to buy one second-hand as well. Okay, so let's talk hardware now, and Samsung are sticking with Snapdragon worldwide for the Ultra, this time using the 8 Gen 3 chipset, and the RAM is now a flat 12GB across the board. On the surface, the phone feels just as snappy as last year's, also super fast S23 Ultra. As always, you might not notice a difference with day-to-day use, though it did feel to me as though apps were staying open in the background for longer. But I was genuinely quite shocked at the performance upgrade with gaming. The new model manages to keep pretty consistent with the S23 Ultra in terms of the temperature. There is a new larger vapor chamber, while slightly improving the power efficiency, but drastically increasing the frame rates it can sustain. I'm not a huge fan of relying on benchmarks, but these really put into perspective just how substantial the performance upgrade is, the graphics in particular. For those who will really push this phone to its limits, as many of you Ultra buyers will, you'll notice the difference. The only potential downgrade I noticed that doesn't seem to align with these benchmarks is that processing edits, for example a simple trim on a video, is now significantly slower than on last year's S23 Ultra. That was an unusual but obvious exception amongst an otherwise pleasing performance upgrade. And this is with the February patch, just to be clear. Power management is better this year too. We have the same 5000 mAh cell inside, but battery life is actually improved, and that's down to the efficiency of the new chipset. I was ending the day with a bit more juice on the S24 Ultra. Under normal use, it definitely has an edge. Streaming YouTube videos for 5.5 hours straight, the new S24 opened up a substantial lead, just to show a simple direct comparison. But I did notice last year's model closing the gap when left in standby mode with the display off. There are some things where the battery is a bit worse. But on the whole, battery life is better, which is actually pretty insane. Battery life isn't one of the aspects I needed or even wanted to see improved this year. This might be the best out there. This phone will comfortably see you through a day and a half of use, and if you do need to top it up, it charges very quickly too. In half an hour you can go from 0 to well over 60%, and it's completely full in just over an hour. It's essentially the same as last year. Phones like the OnePlus 12 put these speeds to shame, but that's plenty fast enough for me. And this leads me on to today's sponsor, UGREEN. You don't get a charger in the box these days, so you're going to want something like this, the UGREEN Nexode Pro. They have a few different versions. This is the 65-watt charger, which enables fast charging for 3 devices at once. They support a wide range of charging protocols, including Samsung's super fast charging, so you can charge the Ultra at full speed. They're also packing overcurrent and overheating protection, and the new GaN InsideTech means you get more efficient charging in an even smaller device. I especially like this one because it fits in the palm of my hand. These are devices I genuinely use every day. I also use UGREEN's braided USB-C cables. They're great. So if you need a new fast charger, then I'd definitely recommend these. I'll leave the links to them in the video description. Okay, so let's now get into the cameras, where Samsung caused some controversy this year by switching out the 10x optical zoom lens for a new 5x lens, but that has a higher resolution. The Ultra is famous for its zoom capabilities, so people were naturally concerned about a potential drop in performance, but I'll show you why you don't need to worry and that this is actually a massive improvement. The other lenses are all the same as last year, we just have the new processing and software features with the S24 Ultra. But let's start with the February updates. Obviously Samsung fixed the display issues, but there were some camera concerns too. For instance, the quality of text at higher zoom magnifications. So on the left here we've got the original software the phone shipped with, and on the right is with the latest update. I think generally there was a small improvement here, but I actually found it was a bit inconsistent. In other scenarios, while some areas improved, others actually seem to be worse. As I said, it's generally an improvement, but don't expect anything drastic. Oh, and here's how the 100x zoom changes. It is overall better here, but you're still going to get that smeared oil painting-like effect at 100 times zoom. One thing I think the new update has just missed entirely is the issue with the high-res mode previews. With both the 50 and 200 megapixel shots, you get some strange processing added to those photos. You can normally see this being applied actually in the preview if you go to the photos fairly quickly. Sometimes they seem softer than photos taken with the regular 12 megapixel mode as well. Remember, they're higher resolution, not higher sharpness. But I can say that the actual photos themselves do look good. So there is still an issue it seems with previewing on the phone, but the high-res shots themselves are looking good. So hopefully Samsung can patch this. But let's get into some comparisons with the S23 Ultra now, and I first want to shout out the massively improved shutter speed. That was a complaint last year, and it is noticeably quicker on the new S24 Ultra. As for the image quality though, it might be the same main camera lens, but there is new processing. And the general trends I noticed were that they've toned down the aggressive brightening and sharpening of photos. The S24 Ultra shots are more often darker now, but it actually allows the colour to come through richer, more saturated, and actually more true to life as well. By the way, you'll notice the vibrancy and detail of the plant on the right. Samsung did address this specifically in the latest update for situations where the intelligent scene optimizer would produce washed out images. Objectively speaking, the new processing is delivering higher image quality. You can see some HDR improvements here too. But it's also completely down to your personal preference. Here you can see more detail on the left with the S23, which you may find better, in the tyre and the ground especially. But I personally like the S24's richer colours and the naturally dark shadows on the right. It's only when cropping in you can see that the S23 is actually over-sharpening. And I also spotted that the heavy softening at the very edges, which the large 200 megapixel sensor can be prone to, is actually not present with the S24 Ultra. Here the over-processing on the left really highlights those white textures in this sofa. Again, you may prefer this, but if you ask me what it looks like in real life, it's far closer to the one on the right. I expect if I asked people to pick a favourite here, the shot on the left would win. It's brighter and it's sharper, and when viewed on a small screen, as many of you are right now, it does look better, even zooming in a bit. But it is washing out the colours more, and more importantly, the over-sharpening has actually created noise, and you can see the more jagged outline of the letters on the left. We saw this a lot last year, and it's one of the key differences with the S24 Ultra. The S23 sharpening helps to an extent. The S24 shots can even appear soft sometimes because of how accustomed we are to Samsung's high levels of sharpening. But the added noise this brings is actually harming the image quality. It's just hard to spot sometimes. Again though, it's ultimately more of a question of personal preference. To the S23's credit, I'd probably choose the image on the left to go on my social media timeline that I'm going to view on a 7-inch phone screen. But overall, I really like and prefer the S24 Ultra's less aggressive image processing. A quick note on the ultra-wide lens, I actually like the more dramatic look on the right. The definition in the clouds is something the February update improves as well. But notice the much bigger shift when switching to the main lens. At the moment, there is less consistency with the ultra-wide and main lenses on the new S24 Ultra. On the subject of the ultra-wide, macro mode didn't seem to offer any significant differences. I did sometimes find it a little easier on the S24 Ultra to find the focus I wanted, but there are no major changes that I noticed. Let's get into the part most of you are here for though, the zoom performance. So here at 3x zoom, the same lens on both phones, you can see the S24's richer colours and it hasn't been brightened as much. And that's good, because cropping in closer, you can see the image on the right isn't as noisy. So we get similar improvements on the 3x telelens as we do on the main. Switching to 5x zoom, we're now using the new 5x lens on the right, whereas the S23 Ultra is digitally zooming on the 3x lens. So we'd expect the S24 Ultra to pull ahead, and it does. The S23 is keeping up fairly well, but the text isn't as sharp. You can see here, for instance, quite a considerable difference in quality. So if we now switch to 10x zoom, you'd expect the quality to swap back, right? Optically zooming on the S23 Ultra's 10x lens is surely better than cropping in on the 24's 5x lens. Well actually, in almost all cases I tested, no. Firstly, notice the out of focus background on the right. The wider aperture of the 5x lens gives you more of that nice bokeh effect. You could even use this lens for portrait mode. But cropping in to see the level of detail, actually the S24 Ultra's text is just as sharp. Digital zoom on a 50 megapixel shot with pixel binning creates a better quality image than an optically zoomed 10 megapixel shot on last year's phone. The white text is kind of glowing on the right and that's slightly spoiling things. But the image is also less noisy because it doesn't need as much sharpening in the image processing. Here's another example at 10x zoom, and I think people would struggle to guess which phone actually has a 10x telephoto lens. Alright, the answer's given away in the sharpening you see on the left. And again, viewing these on device, the S23 shot did appear slightly better in quality. It's only zooming in later I can see the processing issues on the left. But the point is that the S24 Ultra gives you better zoom quality all the way up to 10x. Going above this, you typically see the S23 pull back in front. At 30x and above, for instance, you finally get back the benefit of the greater optical zoom quality. So there is still a trade-off by switching lenses, but consider this, people are going to take photos from 1 to 10x way more often than at 30x and above. So I'm definitely a big fan of switching to this new 5x lens. Another thing to consider is that the S23 Ultra is sometimes reluctant to switch to the 10x lens at all. Presumably because of the smaller aperture, it needs a lot of light. But these were taken during the day and it still happened. And Samsung doesn't let you manually choose a lens unless you go into the Pro photo mode. So I did this and sure enough, the image quality improved. It's weird that this wasn't the default, though of course it now needs extra work to sort out the colour and exposure. And is it better than the S24 Ultra shot? Not really, and it certainly isn't worth the hassle of having to delve into the Pro camera settings. Moving on to night mode now, this is perhaps where you get the most substantial improvement this year. The ultra-wide does still have issues with the white balance and consistency with the other lenses on the new S24 Ultra, as we'll see. but I do want to point out the glare from bright lights in a dark scene. That is something the S24 deals with far better on all lenses, so keep an eye out for that. With the main lens, the S23 Ultra falls to its typical flaw of overexposing. In an attempt to boost shadow detail, you end up losing the natural darkness of the sky. You introduce more noise, and that glare is obviously worse. The S24 image is also sharper, and yet this is the same 200 megapixel main lens, so that's down to image processing. At 3x zoom, we're using the same tele-lens on both phones, but the S23 is struggling with contrast and some overexposed highlights on the left, whereas the S24 Ultra is more natural looking and has better HDR. But zooming in, you'll spot that it's actually got better detail as well. The overall image quality is actually quite a lot higher. At 5x zoom, the S24 Ultra pulls far ahead in quality, and that's exactly as we'd expect switching to the new 5x lens. Its smaller aperture causes no problems at all, and the S23 is clearly struggling with digital zoom on the 3x lens. The zoom improvement with this new 5x lens is even more exaggerated in low light conditions, and the gap just gets increasingly bigger as you zoom further. So at 10x then, you might expect this would flip back and the S23 Ultra would pull ahead, switching to its other telephoto lens, but you'll probably find that 9 times out of 10 it won't actually switch to the 10x at all. As I said earlier, the aperture is just so small at f4.9 that it isn't getting enough light, so the phone will prioritise the wider 3x tele-lens and chooses to digital zoom instead, and that's why the quality is so poor. The S24 on the other hand can crop in on its new 5x tele-lens with relative ease at this zoom level. The phones would do this almost every time in low light. Again, you have to use Pro Mode or a third-party app to manually select the 10x tele-lens. I painstakingly moved the digital slider to try to find the precise point it does finally decide to change over to the 10x lens. And you can see here at 11.3x zoom, for instance, that using the 10x lens is actually far higher in quality than stretching the 3x lens. Here they are side by side. So it's annoying that Samsung doesn't default to this, or at least give you the option in the regular photo mode. Still, next to the S24's 5x lens, you get the benefit of the brighter exposure thanks to the wider aperture, and to be honest, it can pretty much match the S23's sharpness and detail at this range anyway. So for me, the S24 Ultra's new 5x lens is by far superior to the older 10x lens, especially for convenience, let alone the quality improvement. The reduction in glare and the naturally darker shadows, the sky in particular, are the two biggest night mode improvements this year. But it was interesting seeing an image quality improvement even when comparing the same lenses side by side. The S24 would often show better detail and less noise, and these two shots had exactly the same exposure time too. The new 5x lens obviously opens up an even bigger quality gap. As I said, the difference is even greater in low light. But the most surprising thing to me is how it will outperform last year's model even at 10x zoom. For one, because the S23 will just often not engage it, but even when it does, digital zoom on the S24 Ultra's new lens will either match it or beat it. Strangely, there seems to be one low-light downgrade this year with video. The S23 Ultra's footage just seemed to be slightly more detailed and sometimes more stable as well. This doesn't align at all with what I saw with photos, so perhaps Samsung has some software things to work out still with nighttime video. But at the moment, I think the performance is better with last year's model. Daytime video quality gets a nice improvement though. It's similar in terms of stability and HDR, but you'll notice straight away the more saturated and vibrant colours, so it tends to pop more. But there's actually less over-sharpening too, which is great. Now as with photos, some people will actually prefer the sharpness of the S23 Ultra, especially when viewed on a smaller screen. But when you compare closely, you can see that it's over the top and the S24's video looks much more natural. You can also now switch between any of the lenses whilst filming in 4K at 60 frames per second. You can't do this on last year's phone. Plus, you can also get 120 FPS slow-mo at 4K resolution. That's doubled from 60. Those are both enabled by the extra power of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3. I think my favourite new camera feature altogether though is instant slow motion. You can now tap to slow down any video even if you didn't shoot it in slow motion. This is just a regular 4K video I took at 30 FPS. But the phone can interpolate frames in between to create smooth slow motion, and the effect is actually fantastic, indistinguishable from real slow-mo. It's almost instant too, which is so satisfying, and just the fact that you've got instant slow-mo playback in your videos is pretty amazing. You can even save these slow-mo edits into the final video as well. One downside I found with video in general is that the file sizes are considerably larger, roughly twice as big. Even if you have the exact same file format, video quality and settings, they're just a lot bigger this year and are therefore going to take up more of your storage.
Okay, so this is a side-by-side comparison of the front-facing video. We've still got the same recording options on both, up to 4K 60, and I didn't notice much of a difference in terms of the brightness, the sharpness, or the stability. I did think the colours were perhaps a bit cooler on the new S24 Ultra, and possibly a bit closer to real life, and I also thought the mic quality was a little bit crisper on the new model as well. But otherwise, front-facing video is quite similar.
The selfie image quality is very similar to last year's. Once again, there's that brighter processing on the left versus the more saturated and contrasting look on the right. And there seems to be a bit more definition in the sky as well, despite very similar HDR performance. Zooming in closely, I think there's more detail on the right, with the collar, the jacket, and the button, for example. The portrait effect is also near identical. We saw a big improvement with this last year, but I think that's just been maintained this year. Cropping in super close up, you could argue the S24 Ultra is picking up a few more fibers on the jacket, maybe slightly less of a halo around my head, but this is really a stretch, and you should consider the selfie portrait quality to be the same. Okay, so let's now contextualize all of those upgrades and differences with the price. The S24 Ultra starts at an eye-watering $1,300. Not just an insane price tag, but a $100 price increase over last year's model as well. The price is actually the same as last year here in the UK though. For that price increase, you're getting improved ergonomics and durability, a flat, brighter display with symmetrical bezels, that's actually my favourite change, a substantial increase in the graphics and gaming performance, and a refined camera experience with a superior high-res 5x telelens. A refinement is really the best way to describe this year's update. It takes everything that's great about the S23 Ultra and just slightly improves everything to create what is essentially a near-perfect phone. It might be $1,300, but this phone has literally everything. The Ultra is a phone bought by high-end users willing to pay these prices, and you'll struggle to find a better all-round smartphone on the market right now. Current owners of the S23 Ultra of course have no reason to upgrade, especially since those AI features are coming soon, and you'll find last year's model with considerable price discounts now. So even with the increased 7 years of support, it's going to be hard to say that the S24 Ultra offers better value for money right now. Personally, I'd say the even more compelling choices come from the S24 and S24 Plus. The Ultra's baby brothers provide all of the best specs from the flagship in a smaller, far cheaper form factor. I'll be exploring those in full and whether they're actually Samsung's best new smartphones in the next video. Hopefully you found this video helpful though, and if so, then please give it a like. If you want to see how the S24 and Plus models stack up against the Ultra and last year's models, then make sure you're subscribed and also hit the bell icon so you'll get notified when that video goes live. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.